Thank you very much for attending. What we're here to talk about is a little bit about the top sort of 5 findings in 27001 pre-certification audits. I will talk a little bit in general terms about ISO and external audits where there is some data to suggest sort of key findings as well. So I'll be comparing with that. Okay, so a little bit about CertiKit. We're a leading creator of compliance toolkits, if you don't already know this, and we are a provider of ISO services. The company is based in Derbyshire in the UK. Ted and myself, we're sort of more remote working because we're helping clients all over the place, really. Since 2010, we've helped more than 4,000 customers globally achieve sort of compliance to the various standards. We specialize specifically in ISO standards, so the core ones being obviously 9000, 14, 27K, etc., and a little bit about data protection and compliance as well. And we've got various toolkits to support these. Increasingly over the last few years, though, we've been doing more in terms of consultancy and implementation work, and our aim really is to make compliance as easy as it's possible to make it. So that's a little bit about CertiKit. A little bit about me. I'm Joey Lawrence. I'm the CertiKit's lead 27001 consultant. My main role really is for providing internal audit consultancy and implementation consultancy for 27001 to new and current CertiKit customers. And the aim here is really, as part of this consultancy, is providing guidance and advice needed to customers who are considering implementing 27001 using our 27001 toolkit as a starting point. I'm a lead auditor and lead implementer certified. I've sort of been around the block a bit for the last 25 years. I started out in software development, in aerospace, defence, and some various roles in highly compliant industries such as medical devices, and I've held roles as QA and information security management over the years. So what will we cover today? So the main things are, if it will trigger, what our internal audit data shows. So this is sort of just a snapshot, if you like, of the last 2.5 years, and something like over the analysis of like 350 audit findings. This sort of spoils it a little bit, gives the game away by the headings, but these are the main things we'll be focusing on. So these are really where I've come to my conclusion of where our top 5 is. It doesn't mean that there aren't other top 5s out there and issues that are found within external bodies and certification bodies. So these are the main things we'll be looking at today, and my reasoning behind why we've tripped up on some of these top 5 audit findings. And just want to talk a little bit about objectives, because I think this would sort of help organisations address some of the findings around that. Just want to talk a little bit about caveats on the data. I can imagine a lot of cert bodies would be picking up a lot of issues around all sorts of things, and they've got a vast wealth of data and experience and many years of auditing these things. So their data curve may look slightly different to this. This is based purely in our data and the sorts of things I typically picking up in the audits that I do. Also, the other caveat is the data is purely based on the last sort of 2.5 year period as a sample of all of the pre-certification audits that we've done. They won't necessarily align truly to all the levels of non-conformities found by cert bodies, because obviously, as I said, they've got a longer timeline of data, broader collection of clauses, and I'm sure they've seen everything under the sun over the years in terms of areas that found non-conformities. I also have included observational findings as well, because they are sort of indicative of the issues found in the audits, and maybe they just caught me on a good day where I didn't raise it as a minor. I want to talk a bit about bias as well. You know, as an independent auditor, I've no specific bias towards any particular management system I audit. I try to look, you know, as impartial as I can be. But like any auditor, you know, we see things that go on as we do more and more audits, and we sort of see trends of things that are going on. And any auditor would, as you learn from previous audit gaps or major audit errors, always look for those in future audits, just to see if it's a one-off thing with that particular client, or, you know, there is genuinely sort of constantly seeing these types of issues occurring. So I wouldn't say I'm biased, but there will be an element of, you know, I know these things are pickup points that we've tripped up on in the past. So here it is, full fact. This is what our audit data shows. It's not all the data, but what I've done is I've broken down the areas where 3 or more audit findings from 27001 pre-cert audits that we've done, and there's some big areas in there, as you'll see in the red. Scope and context comes up quite a bit. You know, actions to address risks and opportunities, so this is all your clause 4 sort of areas. Document control, bit of that's an area all auditors will pick up on. You know, there's always going to be documents at the wrong versions, this sort of thing, protected marking not right, or, you know, those sorts of things, or generally there'll be out of date stuff. So that's bound to be a pickup point. So I don't really want to focus too much on control of documentation, but if we just skim our eyes through the sort of typical themes that we're seeing, you know, screening background checks, you know, maybe depending on the type of industry, not adequate enough. Organizational roles and responsibilities in authorities not really clearly defined. Management responsibilities are not always clearly defined. IS policy issues, etc. So you can read this at your leisure afterwards, but what I've tried to do is cherry pick what I think are my top 5, you know, things that we constantly always find. So before I go on to the top 5, though, I just want to sort of say, well, how does our data compare to the bigger picture? You know, so I've done a little bit of digging around, Googling, you know, whatever, to sort of see where the external bodies, certification bodies and external auditors have, you know, what their sort of trends are in top 5. And there are some parallels to be drawn here, you can see, with the typical findings from those. However, some of the factors that may come into play as well here, particularly with some of my rankings not being quite in line with some of the things that external bodies find, is the fact that a lot of our audits, as we say, are pre-certification. So sometimes some of the documentation presented is not always fully complete, and there are obvious sometimes gaps that can skew the data a little bit. But you'll see, you know, there are some parallels to be drawn here. My ranked audit findings are scope context. We see a lot of problems around that, but again, that could be down to, you know, that's pre-cert and it's not gone to stage 1 yet, and so therefore they've not necessarily ironed out all of the things that clause 4 requires. Incomplete and inadequate risk assessment, huge parallel there. Do see a lot of issues around that. Information security objectives, again, I could probably draw some parallels with the fact that we're seeing things prior to stage 1. and I'll come on to the reasoning behind why some of those objective issues may be a problem. Actions to address risks and opportunities, weaknesses in policy, ineffective access controls. Again, that's good parallels there with IS policy and active access controls with what external bodies and that are finding. Poorly managed assets. Again, I'll come on to some of the reasons behind that. Control of documented information. And strangely enough, I've been quite lucky here. Although the cert bodies and external parties find a lot of non-compliance with legal and regulatory requirements and poor areas of business continuity and DR, I personally haven't, in the audits I've done, found too many weaknesses here. I've either had a good set of auditees that have really nailed this, or they've been part of our implementational work where we try to dot I's and cross T's on these things. Weak supplier security controls, big risk area. This probably too much. It's a topic in itself, so I won't necessarily focus too much on this because I think, you know, we'd literally take the whole presentation with this. And then responsibilities and external things, sort of find monitoring and logging an issue. So some good comparisons and slight differences. So let's get into my top 5 then. So scope and context, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3. So if we look at context, one of the things the standard requires is internal and external issues be identified. We often find they're poorly defined or even undefined. I've tried to sort of summarize what I think some of the potential causes for this might be. My main feeling is that organizations fail to really document some of those factors prior to implementation that have been problematic. So they're so keen to dive into the standard, they sort of almost forget what's facing, you know, there in their face. They maybe had years of issues and sort of concern areas in the business, and yet they sort of failed to identify that. So, you know, my advice is when embarking on a certification, it's important that you gain an understanding about the things that are going to have a key influence on your management system, as well as leveraging any knowledge of things across the business which you know need improving and you know are risks, so you can actually plan to reduce the effects of those factors. And that's an area I quite often see missing. Examples of that is you could be complaints or feedback or concerns that you know that you need to address. That could be from external sources. Internally, it could be cultural things, awareness generally about cyber risk or policy controls. And these things can have a huge influence on your management system and can actually make it fail in some cases, particularly culture and you know, attitudes of individuals within the organization. So 4.1, big area. Next big is interested parties. Common things I see are scope documents and that with just a simple list, literally a bullet list of interested parties, no explanation of what influence or needs that they have, and really a lack of understanding what an interested party actually is. Clause 4.2 of the standard, to quote it, says that they're understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, and you need to determine who the interested parties that are relevant. I see so many times interested parties that have no relevance to the management system down in their list, and I ask them, well, what are the needs of this interested party and why are they an interested party? And quite often the blank stares give the game away on that one. And also the relevant requirements. So 4.2b says the relevant requirements, and if you don't document what the relevant requirements of the interested parties are, then how are you supposed to know whether you're going to be able to satisfy them? So there's another area that I do often quite see, poorly defined IPs and a failure to actually link to clause 4.2b with the requirements. 4.3 scope. One area that often gets missed with this is the scope doesn't really account for dependencies and interfaces. So internally, they define the scope really well, you know, in terms of the activities of the business, what they're doing, what their products are, etc. But this is probably an area, particularly where organizations are now got huge reliance on external suppliers. So I'm talking specifically here things like SaaS, software as a service, and you know, PaaS providers, or even IaaS. You know, there's a huge dependency on those external providers performing, and the scope doesn't really clearly define what influence these external suppliers have on the business. So quite often you get a lot of audit, well, from me anyway, audit findings on, you know, not really understanding the impact and dependencies. Next my second of my top 5 is incomplete or inadequate risk assessment. And again, this was an area that the cert bodies and external auditors often find. Typical findings that I come across, one is scenario-based risk assessments. Now, it sounds like I'm going to be beating up on people who do scenario risk assessments. That's not the case. But what I find is that scenario-based risk assessments, they commonly fail to adequately address the risks associated with specific IS assets. What do I mean by that? You come up with all the different risk scenarios, but what they fail to do is make a link between how that particular scenario, what assets would be impacted by it. So an example might be, well, you know, we might have a flood, and you go, okay, well, that's a risk, it's a scenario. How likely is it to happen? Not very likely, etc., etc. But what assets would it actually be impacted by that? And if you're, say, fully in the cloud, the actual impact of that risk is not only going to be very low, and the likelihood is there's probably next to nothing or very few assets would actually be impacted by it. So, you know, they risk score the scenario, but the actual impact is not really fully evaluated, and there's no real clear reason why it's a risk. That's why I often prefer asset-based. I'm a bit biased this way. I like asset-based because the idea is you work out what assets you've got within the business, and then you actually work out what threats and vulnerabilities are to them, and you can sort of cover the risk scenarios off a little bit better. Not saying scenario is wrong, but I just find that there's a lack of tie-up when I have clients who do scenario-based risks. IT-related assets. So many times I see risk assessments that just have a list of hardware, or possibly that's a bit unkind, hardware and maybe software as well, and a few documents. But they don't really go look at the big picture of building up your IT assets list properly. You know, 27001 defines an asset as anything of value to the business, and you know, that could be hardware, software, documents, data, information. And the last one I just want to focus on a little bit, people. So many times I see risk assessments done where people is missing. And why is that important? Well, because in any business there's got to be what I call high risk employees. These are the ones that are constantly exposed to high amounts of sensitive data, client data, customer data if you're working on sensitive defense projects, all of this sort of thing. And yet no one really thinks when Johnny, who works in that department, leaves, you know, that all the knowledge and information, everything that's going with him is at a potential risk. And if he does resign, what controls do we need to put around that? Now, some companies, you know, put things like, if certain high risk employees resign, then they put some control measures around it, like maybe an increased amount of logging, monitoring. I know it sounds a little bit big brother's watching you, but you know, if you've got a high risk employee, what's he going to do with that information? And when he actually leaves, you know, are you going to remind them of their obligations and non-disclosure and all of that sort of thing? And I do often see this missed, people particularly and high risk employees missed in risk assessments. So yeah, so back to the point, quite often some risk assessments are very, very poor because they only focus on the IT assets. Number 3, risk ratings and scores. So many times I see risk assessment documents partially complete. And I know sometimes some businesses, depending on who they are, can have hundreds and hundreds of rows of data in their risk assessment, and they're probably falling asleep through half of it, or I think that's what they must be doing. Because many a time, you know, there's the risk scores missing, things not evaluated properly, risk treatments left untracked, etc. You know, and it doesn't really, as an auditor, convince me that you're taking the risk assessment seriously enough and truly want to protect the assets of the business if your risk assessment is partially complete and got missing rows and things not completed. And the other thing, just on the risk reduction and risk treatment, you know, for every risk treatment that there is not implemented in a timely manner and not really tracked properly in a risk assessment, the risk's still there. You know, that's the whole idea behind the risk treatment. You've come up with a control, you've said, right, okay, we need to mitigate that risk and we need to do this. If you don't actually track and manage and actually bother to track your risk treatments and how they're progressing, that risk's going to be there while that control is unmet. So that's a big area I often see in audits. And lastly, strangely enough, the risk output doesn't match the methodology. Many a time I've seen, you know, a risk methodology that says, yeah, we use asset value as a you know, a criteria in our risk scoring and what have you, and you go, right, show me your risk assessment, and there's no asset value in there, there's no factorization of that into the risk score at all. So you know, you go, well, your risk document says you do this, and yet your risk assessment methodology says you do this approach, and yet what you've shown me doesn't even match what your risk methodology says. Next one is clause 613 and 8.3. So vague or incorrect risk treatment. I've seen quite a few occasions where a particular Annex A control is called up to address, you know, being the most direct control to address that risk, and yet what's actually recorded in the risk treatment doesn't even relate to what the control requires. Example of that was there was a risk of an asset not being returned when a staff member leaves, for example, and A5.11 at return of assets was cited as the treatment, but the risk treatment just said inform IT when staff leave. Well, that isn't implementing Annex A 5.1 return of assets. It's you know, it's just paying lip service to it. That was just part of the story. Other examples, physical security. We don't use CCTV surveillance was a mitigation against one risk when in fact they did. They'd missed completely the fact that their building and service provider was providing a supplied service that did exactly all of that, and they hadn't really even thought about CCTV and the physical security bits. So yeah, so really, in a nutshell, to summarise this one, a poor risk assessment really is essentially leaving lots of unidentified and untreated risks just left to take care of themselves. That's clause 8.3, and you're basically playing Russian roulette with your information assets, really. So whilst you've got untreated risks and you're not tracking them, it's anyone's guess where things are in the risk assessment cycle. Actions to address risks and opportunities. So this is what Ted would agree. We call it is clause 611, and we call it the infamous 611 clause. Many times we see this completely missed I've seen it missed by cert bodies. I've seen it missed by other third-party auditing bodies, and it's one that I continually see and continually push to raise. And it really is that the risk assessments fail to include the risks associated with issues raised in clause 4.1 and commonly fail to include the risks of not meeting the requirements of interested parties. So what's clause 6.1.1 really about? It's getting you really to think about the implications of not meeting your needs of the interested parties as part of the risk assessment process. And the reason behind that is so that your organisation can treat or at least reduce the effects of not meeting those implications or the needs of the interested parties. So if you have an interested party who does have very specific requirements and influence and obligations on you, and you fail to meet those obligations, you know, what's going to be the output of that? You know, it could severely impact the business. So including the interested party requirements into your risk assessment to explore the impacts and how these could occur is what the standard's really asking you to consider. So what does that actually mean? What do we have to do to satisfy the clause? So first and foremost, work out who your interested parties is. And then when you've done that, you might have a list, and then you have to truly ask the question, what influence do they have? If they don't have an influence on the management system, they shouldn't really be an interested party. And quite often we do see interested parties listed, and when I challenge them in an audit situation, they go, well, that interested party, oh, I don't really know why they're in there. And so, well, they've got, if you can't explain why they're in there, then maybe they shouldn't be in there. So then it's define needs and requirements. So working out, you should do this as part of your addressing clause 4.2, defining very clearly what the needs and requirements and what influence they have on your management system. And when you've done that, what clause 6.1.1 is then asking you to do is, as part of your risk assessment, determine what impact if these needs aren't met. And I see this missed so many times. Would you agree, Ted? We see it a lot.
Yeah, right across all the different standards. The other thing on this is it asks for the opportunities.
Yeah.
So it's not just looking at the risk side, it's looking at the opportunities that if you do fulfill those requirements and those needs, what opportunities can the business take from it? Whether it's increased customers, bigger footfall, greater sector, market influence, that sort of thing. And like Jerry says, it's missed so many times where people don't read the requirements that, you know, interested parties have an effect upon your management system, that have effect upon your risk.
Yeah. And it sort of comes back to my previous slide that the people could dive headfirst into doing risk assessment, and they go, all right, get all the hardware and software requirements, to throw all them into a risk assessment. They completely miss this point. And not only that, they also miss things like people and, you know, even documents and data and sensitive things in the risk assessment, you know, because they just go full into trying to get a risk assessment done on what they believe are just the IT assets and not what the standard is actually looking for you to risk assess. So what's the impact of not doing this? Well, it could be that if you don't meet an interested party's defined need, it could be quite a bit of, you know, I'm not saying it could be one or all of these, but, you know, there could be some reputational damage by not meeting those needs. It could be even penalties for not meeting those needs, or fines, particularly if one of the interested parties is a regulatory requirement and you don't meet those regulatory requirements, and you've not really assessed the fact that if you have these risks against that, then it could result in fines and penalties for the business, which could be crippling. GDPR is a good example of this one. Next one, control of documentation. I won't spend too long on this, but some of the common areas which we're bound to as auditors. If there's any auditors in the audience, you know that one of the basic requirements of ISO is really, you know, proper control of your management system. And it all sounds a little bit tedious and, oh, well, why do we do, you know, it is important to control your documents. And the reason why, I'll give you an example. If you're a company that operates a safety critical system, and that safety critical system failed for some reason, and you've got some staff there and they go, oh, how do we shut this down? There might be some emergency procedures that they need to follow to shut the system down safely. Well, if you have poor document controls and don't issue and distribute the right versions and the right information to the people that need it, you might get in a situation where those emergency procedures weren't available at the point they were needed, at the time they were needed. So, you know, the staff are left scratching their head going, well, how do we shut this down? You know, nuclear reactor scenario sort of thing. Or they tried to shut the system down in accordance with the policy, the procedure they've got sat in front of them, only to find that the diagrams and the information in it are all out of date and they've got the wrong version. So you can see in those types of situation, document control is absolutely paramount. So, you know, you shouldn't belittle control of documentation and, you know, management of versions and poor document control, because it might have some serious consequences by not controlling it properly. Another thing I see is classification of data. You know, many a time companies will prepare document classification procedure. Oh yeah, we've got all of these different levels. We've got sensitive, we've got personal. Yeah, all great, fine. Right, well, show me all of your documents that you're producing then, and what. Then you suddenly see in protective marking is missing. You know, they've not marked confidential documents up as confidential. So if they don't mark them up as confidential, then they're not confidential then, are they? Oh yeah, they've got business critical. Oh yeah, wouldn't like that. Well, why is it not marked up confidential? So we see this quite a bit where inadequate protective marking and not using the right classifications for data is in accordance with your policies is another area I often see going wrong, particularly in the document control area. And then again, won't dwell on this, but versioning of documents, it's a common thing to see versions of documents in use that don't really align to what the master version should be. And as I say, it might be just an inconvenience, but it could be safety critical. And I think the biggest concern I often see as an auditor, a lot of people see version control and management of W as a burdensome task and not their job to do it, you know. So it's a shame when that sort of the attitude you see within an organisation. And I think this is number 5 of my 5, and this is information security objectives. So typical findings I see is unclear objectives. We often just see one bullet point, you know, oh, it's our objective to improve quality, improve information. Well, how? Yeah, okay. So don't just bullet point objectives. Because by doing that, it's not really evident what your objective is setting out to achieve or how you'll achieve it and who needs to own and manage it. So if you look at the clause of the standard, 6.2 is titled Information Security Objectives, and here's the keyword, and planning to achieve them. So it's not just, oh, just list your objectives and that's the end of it. It's planning how you're going to achieve them and how you're going to plan to make sure that they actually happen. So that's a key part of what the clause 6.2 is about. And what it requires is that objectives are, you know, consistent with the information security policy, i.e. you're not going to implement something that's contrary to policy. Be measurable if practical, and I'll come on to that. Take into account information security requirements, be monitored, communicated and updated and available as documented information. So again, the clause 6.2 goes on to say, you know, when planning on how to achieve its objectives, the organisation shall determine what will be done, what resources will be required, who will be responsible when we're completed. So there's a lot around this. So it is expecting you to not just have a bullet list. It wants you to track things. It wants you to manage and plan. Bullet point 2 here, objectives not tracked or met. When we see objectives not being tracked or met, or status updates, that sort of thing, that's often an indicative thing of an organisation have too many things, so they lose track of what they're actually trying to achieve. So there's sort of, if you like, setting themselves up to failure. Quite often we see conflicts of objectives as well. They do one of the objectives is to do this, and then a bit further down you read another objective and go, well, isn't that going to do the opposite or undermine things that are going to be done by that objective? So they don't look at conflicts and interdependencies of objectives. Often see there's never really a priority given to which ones need to be done, and that comes back to dependencies. And in other words, you can't really achieve that objective until that objective's been done, because if you try to do that one before that one, it ain't going to happen. So we see that quite a lot, and all this really contributes to why objectives are often not being delivered or failing to meet what they intended to do. So there's the dilemma. There's the things that we want. So, you know, yeah, you do need to be smart around objectives, and the smart there is a clue. I don't know whether anyone has come across the term smart objectives. Hopefully some of you have heard the term smart objectives, and I think really what the standard, it doesn't say the word smart, but when it's inferring that when you're doing objectives, you need to define what will be done, what resources, who, when and why, and all of that. That really is what SMART principles are about. So what is SMART? SMART is an acronym really for the following: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time bound. So what do we mean by this, and how will having a SMART objective approach help you? So by applying SMART, we have templates available. I didn't throw one into the webinar, my mistake, but if you're interested in a SMART template, contact me afterwards. But specific, so what does that actually mean? It means it's a very specific, unique objective and a very clear purpose. So it's not trying to achieve multiple things. It's got one purpose, one outcome. And to do that, you need to have well-defined, clear, and focused on a very specific area or improvement. And the next thing is measurable. It can be either qualitatively or quantitatively. I see so many times auditors, and I even had one client said we had an external cert body said we had to make our objective measurable and we had to have a number, and I said no, what you need to do is demonstrate that you've actually met that objective, and how are you going to say when that objective has been achieved? So you can do it simply by saying, well, the output is going to be, say, of that objective, some form of management report, say. So literally a qualitative measure is the report was done, it was issued and approved. That's your measure. While that report isn't issued and approved, then that particular objective is not complete. But once that report is issued and approved, then that particular objective is seen to be met. Or you can go down the quantitative thing where, you know, we maybe have an objective to reduce our incident rates and what have you, because they're taking too long to close. So we can say, well, you know, we've now got 100% of our incidents resolved within 1 week. So we now have a definitive measure on where we're at in terms of our achieving that particular objective. There's a whole bunch of measures that you can apply around things, but you don't have to have it in a quantitative measure. Achievable. This is where I see a lot of objectives fail miserably. Objectives should really be realistic and attainable, given the resources constraints and the time frame you've got. You know, if they're unattainable, then they're not going to happen. You know, and I see so many organizations trying to, you know, trying to make objectives, all these fancy things. Oh yeah, I want to do this and this and this and that, and they're basically setting themselves up to fail. So the achievable part of this is really to get that challenge right and make things so that you avoid conflicting objectives and have too many objectives. Do what you can achieve with the resources that you've got. Relevant objectives should align with the goals. You know, you should never be going off and doing lots of objectives that are going to be either contrary or undermining things that are part of your ISMS, and should align with the broader goals within the business. And time bound. You need to set a time when you expect that objective to be done. That creates you know, an urgency on it, that it needs to be done in the next 3 months or whatever, but also making sure that you can say, well, we set a target of it being done in 3 months, but we're actually going to slip slightly on that, but at least you know where you are. So it does need time bounding. So using SMART principles, you should really help to demonstrate to, you know, any auditor that you're taking your objectives seriously, that you're actually monitoring, measuring, and actually understanding how those objectives are contributing towards the overall information security goals. Or if you're doing a quality system, for example, your quality goals, because SMART isn't just for information security, it's just a good principle for how you can track any form of objective or any sort of project. So my sort of last slide on other things that I typically see, so many audits I do, you know, the client hasn't even got a copy of the standard. So without a copy of the standard, how do you even know what the requirements are that you're being expected to meet? And quite often, you know, this leads to many an audit finding because there are simply areas or gaps where the requirements are not implemented because they don't have a copy of the standard. They don't realise there's a gap until we point it out. And if so, also get 27002, which is the guidance that really goes into the detail about why, you know, what these controls are about and the sort of evidence and things that you need to provide. From a CertiKit, this is very much a CertiKit thing. Obviously, you know, we've said we provide toolkits, and our toolkit has got, you know, quite a number of, I forget the number, Ted, off the top of my head, 150 documents, something like that. But again, you know, the standard very much says, you know, a lot of the Annex A controls, for example, you know, you need to determine which Annex 8 controls are applicable or not, and many people don't go through that exercise, and they try to implement a management system with just about every template that's in the kit, only to realise afterwards, well, that control is not even applicable to you. So why would you implement policy or procedure around that particular control? Because we've identified in the risk assessment that it's not something that you would apply, or it's not even relevant to your business to apply those controls. So it's just, again, a lack of understanding that you don't have to implement absolutely everything that comes in the toolkit. It's very much down to understanding how Annex A is used and which controls are applicable to you, and selectively pick the policies and procedures and everything that are relevant. So just a few things we find specific to how clients have often tried to use our toolkits. So how can we help you then? So that's the end of my bit about my sort of top 5. How can we help you now? As I said in the beginning, we do a number of toolkits. So we've got a lot of the toolkits that support many of the ISO standards. We also provide what we call a logo replace services. Effectively, if you want to personalize the toolkit and your logo and in one fell swoop, so it saves a lot of time when you're actually building your management system documentation. The area that myself and my sidekick today, Ted, we are the services team. We're pretty much involved in ISO consultancy. So although our toolkits are designed to be used without needing necessarily additional consultancy, sometimes customers really want to get focused, understand we need help, support and some expertise, and so this is where we come in and can hold you through the process. Two levels with that: we can do a full implementation support, or we can just be brought in on an ad hoc basis. Another growing area now, and this is an area, you know, we're doing a lot of things, and a lot where the data came from for today. We do a lot of internal auditing as well. This is at pre-cert level, and also we're now increasingly doing clients' audits for them on their behalf. So this is useful if you're a company that's relatively small, don't have a compliance or QA department or an IS team, and you want some independent auditing to do your internal audits for you. So this is a growing area for us as a business. I hope everything that I've sort of pointed out today, as I say, they're very much my top 5, but there are some good parallels here with the sort of things that the cert bodies and external bodies are picking up. So I'm sure hopefully some of the sort of findings and things that I've recommended will help you to try and avoid those pitfalls in either your own journey or implementation of the management system, or even if you're currently certified, and you know, it just gives you some idea of you know, areas that can potentially get wrong and good pick up points that as auditors tend to find. So again, thank you very much, and just drop your questions into the chat window if you've got anything that you particularly want to ask.
We've got one here, Jerry, from Valid. It says, it was a good session. I always find that segregation of duty areas, if you have any or have something across that, please do share.
Oh yes, segregation of duties.
It's one of your favourites.
It is one of my favourites. It's not in my top 5 because, but yeah, it's a sticky area, because trying to figure out the best way of defining it. My advice is just work out, have a look at all your processes that you've got across the business, and don't try to, you know, over egg the pudding here, but basically look at all the processes you have and decide which ones would be a conflict of interest. You know, which ones are going to present information security risk to you, which processes sensibly can have a degree of segregation. Common ones I come across are obviously finance processes, you know, the people that can approve and set up suppliers in the finance system, and who can pay those suppliers and approve invoices. You've got Brenda in accounts who does all of that. That's a bit of a risk. So yeah, you need to work out certain degrees of financial segregation. Other areas I would recommend, I don't know what industries people are from here, but things like review and approval. You know, the person who an approver can be a reviewer, but he shouldn't be the only reviewer and approver of a document. There should be some independence there. Release processes in software, you know, the people who release and deploy live software into a live environment. That's another example I sort of look for. You know, is it delegated to a person with certain responsibility, and it's just not a free-for-all that anyone can just deploy, you know, tested and release software into a live environment. There should be some controls. The other one is setting up a privileged access account. many a time an IT manager, you know, they're dangerous people, IT managers, because they've got the admin rights just about everything, and they can just set their own admin rights upon other systems because they have that power to do so. But, you know, I strongly suggest that, you know, admin accounts should be an area where you look at segregated duties, so that there is someone independent of that person that can at least validate whether that IT manager or that IT user can have those admin level privileges. And when you've worked all these processes out, document them so that it's clear to an auditor that you've thought about it and you've highlighted which processes require segregation, and then try and figure out what steps of the process need that degree of segregation and document that. So hopefully that was useful and answered the question.
A couple of others, mate. One from Kevin. He says, when it comes to compliance with regulatory or contract obligations, if you do not comply with these two groups, would you fail certification, or would it be identified as a non-conformity to work towards?
I take it by the question you're saying that if I'm doing an audit right now and I see that you're not meeting a legal and regulatory requirement, then what I would personally do is I would stop the audit at that point and call an emergency meeting with the senior management and say, as part of my audit, I have actually spotted that you are not meeting a legal and regulatory requirement, and it's my obligation to report this to you, and it would be a major non-conformity. That's all I could do because I'm not the actual regulator. But by triggering the major non-conformity, I would hope that the organisation would take that major non-conformity and act upon it in a manner that, you know, would be appropriate. So if they have an obligation to report that non-compliance to a regulatory authority, then I would expect them to do so.
Okay, another one then, Jerry. Is a RACI model a mandatory document?
No.
No, I didn't think so.
I personally don't like them. Well, it depends. I like them for simple things, but quite often I've seen some races that are like flipping out, you know, they'll send your eyes dizzy with the number of colours. And I think if you've got like a RACI chart for a department that says, right, okay, in this particular procedure or process, you've got 3 people involved and he's responsible and accountable for that, then I find them really useful. The other thing I do find with them, they get out of date quite quickly, and they don't always reflect changes to processes particularly well. But I'm not against them, but I'd rather see a table in a procedure that says, right, okay, IS manager, he's responsible for this, he's accountable for this, and these are the main duties and things that he is expected to do, and it's clear then, because often a RACI chart doesn't say necessarily, it says he's responsible and accountable, but it doesn't say what he's responsible and accountable for. It's very, they tend to be very generic and very high level, if that makes sense. But no, it's not mandatory to have a RACI.
Okay, final one, mate. From Bethany. Really good advice on measures. Any advice on creating smart measures which also drive improvement, so we don't sit on our laurels of achieving 100% for each measure?
Smart measures. Well, I use my own acronym for measures. It's called RAVE, R-A-V-E. First and foremost, that is, if you're going to create a measure, they need to be relevant. You know, what are you measuring? And is that measure actually indicative and relevant to what you're trying to actually apply that measure to? Does it actually say, you know, we are X% or whatever? So you need to think very carefully about measures. So R is the relevant bit. A, means that they're accurate. There's no point having measures that are inaccurate, because if you're going to make judgments on any measure, they have to be accurate. There's no point saying, well, it's roughly in the ballpark, you know, because if you're going to expect people to react to that measure in real time because it's gone over a threshold or below a threshold, whatever that measure is trying to achieve, if it's not accurate, then people will be running around like headless chickens going, oh, that measure's gone to red now, we need to do something, when if it's not accurate, then it might not actually be red. It might really, the true measure might actually be amber. So yeah, so that's the A bit. V is verifiable or validated. You should always validate your measures. It's I would say the V bit of it is where you're calculating measures. It's not too bad where the measures are fairly straightforward, but sometimes, particularly with complex KPIs, you've got formula involved, and you need to verify, is that formula actually working out that measure correctly? Because that again leads to the accuracy thing. You know, if it's not calculating the thing right, then how do we know it's accurate? And so you have to verify your measures, and do they actually answer the question you're asking them? And then E, the E bit, the RAVE, easy to collect. You know, I see so many times that people try to, you know, create massive databases, God knows, you know, try and make them easy to collect so that they're not a bird. And I suppose lumping in with easy to collect is don't have too many measures. I'd rather, as an auditor, see an organisation effectively monitoring a small number of measures that are relevant and meaningful to the organisation, and not having millions of measures and they never analyse it. Because what's the point of having, you know, thousands of measures and expecting someone to actually do something with them? You know, so sometimes with modern systems, it's so easy just to collect numbers. You can query a database, or you can do this, that and the other, but sometimes you can have too many measures, and then it's so easy from an auditor's point of view going, well, show me what you did with that measure, then show me what your data, you know, oh well, we didn't do anything with that. Well, non-conformity, you know, shoot yourself in the foot. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, let me know. Is that it?
Yep.
Okay, well, again, thank you very much for attending. Hopefully you found some of this information useful. Maybe when you get the presentation, you can go through it, maybe look in your own organisation if these pickup points are there. If so, good luck improving. That's what it's all about.